today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the New Zealand Prime Minister on her first official visit to China. What's on the agenda? And Korean Peninsula diplomacy in the works, with the return of Korean War remains to China in time for Tomb Sweeping Day.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Monday to Friday on CGTN. We begin in Beijing, where New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern is on her first visit to China since took office. She met with Chinese President Xi Jinping, who expressed condolences over the victims in the Christchurch mosque attacks, which left 50 people dead. He said Prime Minister Ardern's visit shows how much New Zealand government values its relations with China. New Zealand is one of the first Western countries to establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. Since diplomatic ties began 47 years ago, it has been a showcase for East-West diplomacy. Prime Minister Ardern said New Zealand adhered to the One China policy and a firm supporter of free trade and multilateralism. She said ties with China have been one of New Zealand's most important and far-reaching relationships. New Zealand Prime Minister Ardern also held talks with Chinese Premier Li Keqiang, and they agreed to strengthen cooperation and jointly safeguard a rules-based multilateral trade system. They also witnessed the signing of cooperation documents on taxation, agriculture, finance, and scientific research, and issue a statement on climate change. Let's have a look.
A trip postponed and shortened following terror attacks last month in her native New Zealand. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern was welcomed by Chinese Premier Li Keqiang Monday at the Great Hall of People. Originally planned as a three-day trip to Beijing, Ardern trimmed it into one. Premier Li rendered his condolences to victims as their bilateral talks began. Li says China values its relationship with New Zealand.
We should improve our mutual political trust, increase people-to-people exchanges, and seek the greatest common divisor in ties based on equality and mutual respect.
Ardern says New Zealand is proud of its relations with China, including the free trade agreement signed in 2008.
I did, though, want to visit Beijing at this time to underline the importance that we place on our relationship with China. It is one of our most important and far-reaching relationships.
Following Monday's meeting, 4 agreements were signed as the two governments agreed to avoid double taxation, increase agricultural cooperation, and carry out more financial talks and scientific research projects. China is now New Zealand's largest trading partner and second largest source of foreign tourists. The 2019 China-New Zealand Year of Tourism opened Saturday in Wellington. Ardern is visiting China for the first time since taking office in 2017. The visit was first scheduled late last year, but China withdrew the invitation at the time following strained political ties, and it was only rescheduled recently. The two countries had disagreement after New Zealand banned Chinese telecom company Huawei from providing 5G technology to a local carrier.
So how are relations between China and New Zealand shaping up with the Kiwi Prime Minister's visit to Beijing? Let's turn to our panelists joining us from different parts of the world. With us in Auckland and in New Zealand, Stephen Jacoby, Executive Director of the New Zealand-China Council. Welcome, sir. In Suzhou, we have Bo Zhiyue, the Deputy Dean of the Xipu New Era Development Research Center. And he used to be the Director of the New Zealand Contemporary China Research Center. And with us in Beijing, we have Guo Chunmei, Research Fellow of the Institute of South and Southeast Asian and Oceanian Studies at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. My first question goes to you in New Zealand, Mr. Jacoby. So what exactly are the expectations from New Zealand this time for this very short but important visit?
Yes, this is a very important visit to China by Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, and what we are really hoping for is increased momentum in our relationship. We have a very good relationship that has been built over many years, but especially off the back of our free trade agreement, which entered into force in 2008. But now is the time for the Prime Minister and the Chinese leadership to really build some new momentum into the relationship between us.
Several different issues, Mr. Jacoby. If you could be just a little bit more specific. Agricultural development, we also see some science and technology cooperation. Meanwhile, there's likely to be an update of the trade possibilities. What exactly do you think is the core here? Briefly, sir.
Well, what is very important to us is that we upgrade the free trade agreement that we signed over 10 years ago. And we want that negotiation as ongoing, but we really want to bring that agreement into the 21st century. It's very important that we do so that we can promote greater exchanges of New Zealand agricultural products, food products, natural resource-based products, and so we can also bring in increased amounts of Chinese manufactured products, technology and investment. All of these things are critically important for the New Zealand economy.
Professor Bo, of course, China is New Zealand one of its biggest trading partners. This upgrade to China, what exactly is the content in that version?
Well, I think, when people are, in New Zealand, people tend to talk about there are three priorities for New Zealand in terms of New Zealand-China relations. They are trade, trade, and trade. But I think now, because China and New Zealand have built this comprehensive strategic partnership, I think this relationship should not be limited only to trade. Probably should be extended to other areas like people-to-people relationship, visitors, tourists, and students, and so on and so forth.
Right, but Mr. Bo, my question really is, if it is about trade, which is very important core of this relationship, what exactly is the content that China wants in the eventual result of this very short trip? Mr. Bo.
From China's perspective, New Zealand is very, very important because it's actually part of China's strategy in South Pacific area. Of course, you also need to talk about Australia as well.
But Mr. Bo, when it comes to trade, it's not just about the Belt and Road Initiative. It's also about the upgrade of the earlier agreed trade agreement. And New Zealand was one of the very first, shall we say, Western economies recognized China's market economy status. So there's a lot of specific content, in fact, in the discussion. Professor Bo, to you, what exactly are they, if you can?
For China, I'm not sure. I think for China's side, I think there's more of upgrade of this technology in terms of the science technology development, because China is upgrading its own economy from this manufacturing-intensive economy to this technological-based, more advanced economy. So in that regard, I think China would probably use New Zealand as a kind of a test ground for for trading with more advanced products instead of just traditional products.
On the other hand, without technological cooperation, it's almost impossible to see a further increase of the trade, because after all, New Zealand and China, when it comes to trade, has already been doing a very good job, Mr. Jacoby.
That's right. Trade has increased quite considerably, and we do need to be thinking about new areas, particularly around technological cooperation. For example, I understand the Prime Minister and the Chinese government has today released a statement on environmental cooperation, but the technologies involved in greening the Belt and Road, for example, is something that's of great interest to New Zealand. And it is true that we need to go beyond trade into those people-to-people areas, particularly in terms of tourists and students, but also professors and scientists. In fact, there's lots of things that we can do together.
Now, Mr. Jacoby, to you, since you are the only New Zealand panelist that's here, may I ask you about that? New Zealand is one of those countries in the so-called Five Eyes cooperation of exchange of data and intelligence among the most developed economies. And also we see some try to play the geopolitical card in the Asia-Pacific region, even though China and New Zealand try to shy away from those. So what exactly do you think New Zealand will be able to do, given the fact it is in the region, it wants to have a bigger trade, it wants to have good relations with all partners, it wants to have a very independent foreign policy.
Yes, that's right. New Zealand's a small country. It's a Western-oriented country. It's a market democracy. And so, yes, those things are extremely important to us, and we need to maintain some sort of balance between greater powers who have sometimes different issues with each other. But I think New Zealand has a lot of experience in dealing with larger countries. After all, despite the considerable differences in size and scale, we have been the first developed economy to negotiate and conclude an FTA with the with China, something actually we have not been able to do with the United States. So I think there is plenty of opportunity for us to be innovative in the way we work with China.
How innovative will that be?
From time to time we have to make decisions in our own national interest. We have to find clever ways of working together. For example, under the Belt and Road Initiative, there's an opportunity for New Zealand to expand exchanges of innovative companies. We want to make it easier for our companies to be able to cooperate with their Chinese counterparts, to go to China to find commercial partners, to get the groundbreaking but sometimes quite niche technologies we have in New Zealand, for example in the area of environmental cooperation. That's something that can be put into a Belt and Road perspective, and so that we can build that cooperation. Beyond that, there are other things that we can do. What about the link between China, New Zealand and South America? How can we extend the Belt and Road across that southern link to open up new possibilities for exchange?
Those are very encouraging directions, Professor Bo, isn't it?
Well, I think I think both sides are trying very hard to have a balanced relationship, because especially for New Zealand, which is a relatively small country, a Western-oriented country, but they have to juggle between two major powers, basically between China and the United States. In terms of the economic issues, I think New Zealand has worked more closely with China, but in terms of security issues, I think New Zealand is working more closely with the United States, because anyway, New Zealand is part of the West, especially in security issues. So this is actually similar for many smaller countries, such as Singapore and many, Malaysia. All these small countries, they are actually torn between two major powers, especially when the two major powers have some tensions or problems. So I think New Zealand has been doing very well in this regard.
We have seen the relationships among so-called East and West going ups and down during different eras of development over the past decades since the PRC was found. But we always see in some of those developed economies very smart in their approach toward China and toward their other partners. It really takes leadership in a way to be able to go through the so-called bumps, and in order to achieve the best results for all. Ms. Guo, about that, about leadership, that Prime Minister Ardern demonstrated both recently at the terrorist attack in New Zealand, and in her strong leadership about approaching different partners, including this time making a trip to China right after the attack, was quite a impressive track record for a young leader like her. After all, she was new in the field, only became the Prime Minister 2 years ago, or less than 2 years, in fact.
Yes, Jacinda Ardern is the youngest female Prime Minister in the world, so she's charming and admirable. As you just said, the terrorist attack in Christchurch didn't stop her trip to China. It demonstrates that Jacinda Ardern attached much importance on the relationship with China. She wanted to put the relationship back on the track.
But about a terrorist attack, there's certainly things that can be done. When it comes to data exchange, when it comes to intelligence exchange, when it comes to anti-terror cooperation between China and New Zealand. Because after all, many of the roots of the terrorism China and New Zealand faces are coming from same root problems. So Ms. Guo, what about that? Is there some space that both countries can explore together?
Yes, counterterrorism is in the common interest of both countries, as well in the world. So terrorism is the enemy for all the countries. as we know, New Zealand is the most secure countries in the world. Maybe there are some more space for China and New Zealand to share the intelligence or some information about the terrorists.
Okay, well, Mr. Jacoby, I would like to ask you also about that as well.
Well, I think it's in New Zealand's interest to have the widest possible discussion with China about all aspects affecting our national life. The recent incidents, of course, in Christchurch were the work of a white supremacist, which is completely baffling to many of us here in New Zealand, and I think we have demonstrated in the aftermath that we are very welcoming here in New Zealand of all types of people, all ethnicities, all religious persuasions. This is the nature of New Zealand society, but I'm sure that this matter will have been covered in Prime Minister Ardern's discussions in Beijing today.
Well, now, Mr. Jacoby, Prime Minister Ardern, as we mentioned, are quite new on the job, but she has been demonstrating very strong leadership about Christchurch attack, and also her determination to have a very independent foreign policy with the context of having good partnerships with different kind of players in the world. So how is the country seeing her, becoming ever stronger, and particularly during this trip to China?
Well, I think there's a lot of support for Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern in the community, and particularly a deep sense of gratitude for the way she has coped with the terrible situation that arose in Christchurch. She has led our nation both through a grieving process and through various policy measures that are going to make it harder for that sort of thing to happen ever again here. And I think it's also a reflection of her leadership that she has decided to visit China. And we're grateful to the Chinese leadership for receiving her at this time. The people of New Zealand, I think, appreciate that we have to have the strongest possible relationship with China and with other countries around the world. That means we have to meet and we have to talk. Sometimes we have to talk about the things we want to do together. Sometimes we have to talk about our differences. But it's much better that we are meeting in this way.
Communication is the key here, as we all know. It's always true. To you, Professor Bo, right after the attack at Christchurch, Chinese President Xi Jinping sent a letter of condolences to the New Zealand side, expressing our deep concern about terrorism and also our utmost support for the New Zealand people. Now, we see the Prime Minister is now making a trip to China. This really is making quite a case about what governments together could do. Now, we also see the Prime Minister was very efficient in her country, in fact, compared to some of the other countries, to change and update the gun control law in New Zealand. And that has won great support in the country and beyond. So now, Professor Bo, here's the thing, that is, what countries, even as geographically small as New Zealand, but has big power in updating itself and set a good example for the rest of the world? Professor Bo.
Yeah, New Zealand is a country of diversity. It is also a very welcoming country. So that's why you have a variety of people coming to New Zealand feel at home. However, there are also issues, especially with gun control. That's why one of the reasons why this person was able to get into New Zealand to get training in shooting, and then eventually use the gun bought from New Zealand. So I think New Zealand government, especially under leadership of this Prime Minister, was very effective and very efficient in terms of implementing a new policy and trying to communicate with leaders from around the world to rally support internally as well as externally. I think this is a kind of a demonstration of this new leader who is even though relatively new, but he's a very strong leader who is able to get support from all around.
Right. And finally, before we go, final words from all of you, if I can, one sentence. What do you think, if done, is the best result we could have of this very short but certainly important bilateral trip between China and New Zealand? Ms. Guo, one sentence.
Yeah. Keep the bilateral relations more mature and resilient.
I see. Professor Bo.
I think there will be an upgrading of FTA.
Well, yes, I think so. Before we go, Mr. Jacoby.
I think the main emphasis and outcome needs to be a strengthening of our relationship across the board and to commit to talking to each other more frequently at high level.
That would be a very welcoming result, I guess, for both people and both countries. Thank you so much for being with us, the three of you. Really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Korean Peninsula diplomacy in the works with the return of China's war debt right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live Monday to Friday on CGTN. South Korea will return the remains of Chinese soldiers killed in the 1950s Korean War on Wednesday. On Monday, the remains of 10 soldiers known as the Chinese People's Volunteers were laid in coffin. A Chinese delegation was present at the ceremony when the South Korean military wrapped the remains in the port city of Incheon. Their bodies will be buried at a martyrs cemetery in Shenyang, the capital of northeast China's Liaoning province. In the past 5 years, the remains of nearly 600 Chinese soldiers have been repatriated. This handover will happen just before Qingming Festival, a traditional Chinese festival to visit the tombs of ancestors and clean their graves. About 200,000 martyrs of the Chinese People's Volunteers were listed in China's Ministry of Civil Affairs in 2014, most of them killed during the combat and buried on the Korean Peninsula. Though South Korea has made efforts to return their remains more than half a century later, many of the fallen fighters have yet to return home. Here's a look at how Beijing and Seoul are working together to change that picture.
In September 1954, the United Nations Command sent back the remains of 10,000 Chinese soldiers. From 1981 to 1997, South Korea returned 43 soldiers' remains to China, with the help of the DPRK. But since then, the DPRK has declined to help Seoul with the transfers, so China and South Korea sought an arrangement with each other instead. In 2013, the two sides agreed that Seoul would return newfound remains to China on a yearly basis. The following year, that arrangement bore fruit. For the first time, the remains of 437 soldiers returned to China directly from Seoul. They were laid to rest at the Martyrs Park Cemetery in the northeastern city of Shenyang. Since then, South Korea has sent remains back every March, with the bodies of 589 soldiers returning to Chinese soil since 2015.
Now, on South Korea's efforts to return remains of China's Korean War dead, with us in our Beijing studio, Zhao Tong, a fellow from the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, and Einar Tangen, our current affairs commentator. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Certainly, this is another one in a series of goodwill gestures, Mr. Zhao, South Korea is showing to China, reflecting back on the history.
Yes, of course, South Korea really wants Chinese help, especially given the current dialogue over the Korean denuclearization negotiation. Most importantly, I think South Korea recognizes China's role as an increasingly important player in regional and international security and foreign affairs issues. So South Korea has been repatriating the remains of Chinese fallen fighters in Korean War since 2014, even during the difficult years of 2016 and 2017 when the bilateral relationship was at a historical low due to the status dispute. This cooperation continued. So I think this is a very important confidence building measures between the two militaries, between the two peoples, the two nations.
Right, and of course there's a lot of talk, Mr. Tangen, about the peace mechanism. How should it be established involving North Korea, South Korea, China, the United States? After all, these countries went to war during the Korean War. So does that give us a little bit more confidence about the working together spirit, at least?
Well, yes, I think for China, yeah, of course, but the U.S. side is a little bit more problematic. Donald Trump's, note that he demanded that they give up and, give the U.S. all their nuclear materials and things like that. It tends to put a lot of uncertainty. This just wasn't even realistic, and yet it was being proposed. So I do think this is part of its confidence-building measures that you're talking about, and that China is going to figure more largely.
Yeah, but on the other hand, Mr. Zhao, how much will China and South Korea be able to work together to play a constructive role in putting the other two parties together? After all, the other two parties have to talk, not South Korea and China. The latter two have already been very constructive.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. North Korea is, I think, reconsidering its negotiation strategy going forward. North Korea has been reluctant to attend inter-Korean cooperation meetings, joint meetings, cooperation projects. And North Korea is not talking with the United States substantively. There was even increasing signs of North Korea thinking about more provocative actions going forward, like the possible launch of a space vehicle. So there's a real risk that the previous goodwill negotiation could get derailed.
Well, after all, the goodwill negotiation did not reach anywhere for the second round, at least. Media reports suggest. Now we do not know because neither side have confirmed about this. What's going on between them during the Kim-Trump summit in Vietnam, Hanoi, was the U.S. side proposed a U.S. definition of denuclearization. Obviously, rather Pyongyang did not see that as appropriate, at least for the moment. Now, that's only according to media report, which once again do not know exactly what happened in those negotiation rooms when they're going one by one with one another. But Mr. Tangen, from now to the next step, are we going to go back to zero and try to figure out a new way again?
No, I don't think so. I mean, a lot of Moon's efforts have been aimed at trying to pull things together, and he's continuing to do that. And I think he increasingly looks at China. Remember, North Korea's issue is that they need a security guarantee, and that can be offered by different parties. Hopefully it would be offered by the U.S. as part of an end to the war, but there's also Russia and China. So it could be that South Korea is starting to look for other partners who it can work with to create a lasting peace.
The sequence issue is very important about which party to do what and the other party react with the different kinds of sequence and actions. And so now, do we have any signs of roadmap? I mean, after all, the first Kim-Trump summit, there seemed to be a little hope of it. Now, the second one seemed to be ended up without any result, or probably even went backload. So do we have any sign of a roadmap, at least among the four most important parties?
Well, as the first step, at least all the major powers seem to agree about the importance of pursuing a joint roadmap. Steve Biegun, the American special representative for North Korea, was in Beijing a couple of weeks ago, and according to him, the United States basically tried to talk North Korea into agreeing to three things. One is their current capability, a declaration. Second, what's the meaning of the end goal of denuclearization? And thirdly, what's the roadmap to get us from here to there? And according to his statements in his meetings with Chinese officials in Beijing, China is also fully on board on the importance of the three items. I think South Korea is in full agreement as well. So at least I think we agree what are the most important goals to pursue in their interim time frame. But regarding the roadmap, I think there are technical assessments provided by experts that says even if the political environment is purely supportive, the dismantlement, the verification process itself can take as long as 20 years.
That's true.
And now the different countries have different views on how the political perspective should be incorporated into the technical stuff. So I think it's high time for scholars, experts, as well as officials from these countries to sit down together and to try to figure out what the main elements in this roadmap should look like.
We hope that would happen, but you seem to be spirit-free in not thinking there are political cycles in different economies, different countries that we are talking about here. Now, Mr. Tangen, from the U.S. side, there's suggesting suggestions rather, in the media report about the division among Mr. Biegun, for example, the special representative, and also the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor. It really has a balanced act as to who that President Trump will get the year off when they are making their suggestions. So, Mr. Tang, a lot of unpredictability in terms of internal politics.
Absolutely. I mean, it was very surprising. I don't know if you noticed that when they sat down at the table in Vietnam, that Bolton was added on as an extra. There was, there were 4 people on the North Korean side, and then all of a sudden 5 showed up. That's a breach of protocol. You never have that happen. So he was obviously added at the very last moment. And this kind of ad hoc diplomacy, this idea that you can kind of go there and make a deal, it might work when you're doing real estate. Unfortunately, it does not work as well when you're doing diplomacy.
But we have to make it work. I mean, there's no other option. Do we have any other option besides get all these countries to agree upon a roadmap and do it step by step? We do not have any other option rather than this, do we?
No, you don't, but the issue here is that what is it in it for the North Korean side? I mean, the reason it takes 20 years is they want a quid pro quo. And they're saying, yes, we can start down this road, but we have some things on our agenda. Now, the question is, do all the parties agree to that? I think China is more open to it, South Korea is more open, but politically, Trump cannot be, because he has criticized all of the previous efforts that wound up with what he said, with egg on their face, because they did not get what they bargained for.
Mr. Zhao?
Well,
I heard that long sigh. That long sigh has been frequenting any conversation about the Korean Peninsula denuclearization process. I hope it will be ever shortened. Mr. Zhao, go ahead.
I'm not sure North Korea really wants the status quo. I mean, so far things look good inside North Korea. The oil price is stable, the rice price is stable, but we don't know why, whether this is because North Korea's economy is really functioning well because of domestic market reform, increasing external economic relationship with South Korea, Russia, etc., or is it simply because North Korea is quickly burning up its existing strategic stockpile of all the important goods and items like oil, etc.? If it quickly uses them up, North Korea's economy could face a real challenge in the near-term future. So I don't think North Korea wants to wait and see. I think there is a time pressure on North Korean side as well as the American side. As long as the status quo is maintained, North Korea is free to expand its nuclear arsenal. The nuclear risk continues to increase. So I think both sides still have strong incentives to break the current status quo.
Well, it's very hard to specifically get a closer look at what exactly is going on in DPRK besides the official media reporting. We hope they will have more concrete information coming out. Having said that, though, since we're talking about repatriation of the war debt, the definition of this war, and whether 4 parties involved, China included, will agree upon it, and from there to develop step-by-step mechanism, as we earlier discussed, about how to provide security guarantee and end this war, is still open. So now, what is some of the most important steps from the two of you, if you can, that all the countries involved will be able to agree upon and develop from there to, shall we say, to smooth over the wounds and face up to history together?
Well, if I can go first,
go ahead,
I do believe, as China and South Korea are able to do this cooperation of remains repatriation, it really shows, the Korean War has long ended, at least between China and South Korea. And I think it's certainly necessary to officially end the Korean War between the two Koreas as well, and also between North Korea and the United States. I think at Hanoi, it was reported that the two parties actually agreed on a political declaration to end the war. They just failed to agree on denuclearization, therefore they didn't announce their end of war
Once again, those are according to media reports, as we do not know from either side confirming. And there could be clouds that people send out in order to get others on board, in order to...
Right, and a more important point is the Chinese-South Korean cooperation shows that decades after the end of the war, they can start to handle historical disagreements with respect, with dignity.
Right.
They can, these joint excavation efforts, this joint commemoration of the fallen fighters, these activities themselves create an opportunity for them to begin to appreciate their different perspectives on their history. This can happen between China and South Korea, and this certainly can happen between DPRK and the United States.
And in fact, it is happening as we
well.
speak. Earlier, there were repatriation of the American war dead from DPRK to the United States, and of course, President Trump was claiming that was quite a victory for him in this regard. But Mr. Tangen, there has to be a series of goodwill gestures from both sides, step by step, in order to build very gradually this long-lost confidence in one another.
Well, I would agree, and I'd say the first part is of course, what you said. There has to be a peace treaty. You have to end this war, but there has to be attached to that a roadmap. Exactly what you said. The 3 principles that were then, and then there has to be some for North Korea. If not, this isn't going to go anywhere. All the confidence-boosting measures in the world, you still have to get down to some basic deal points. There has to be a kind of mutuality, a win-win for both sides.
But when it comes to history, things are very complicated, as we all know. There are different versions of describing the Korean War in the 4 countries that we talk about: China, South Korea, DPRK, and the United States, particularly the United States. I would assume, Mr. Zhao, if you went to Washington, you would see monuments one after another indicating the American version of the war. Of course, many people died innocently, including those soldiers, but how history is being viewed and articulated, that would build a momentum about how Americans would feel about their national plan to solve the problem. Mr. Zhao.
I think exactly. Even today, American and Chinese scholars argue about who actually fired the first shot that started the Korean War. But over time, I think people started to recognize that it's okay that people have different interpretations of history. They all have different historical background, nationality, different culture. That they all affected their perspective. So the important thing is we all look at it as the different sides of the same coins. You allow people to have different views and then try to work jointly in narrow some of the disagreements, and most important, looking forward. The page has been turned. Now we are living in a different world: economic interdependence, social people-to-people exchange. We are in a region where we can only jointly address our challenges, like air pollution, non-proliferation, etc., etc.
Yes. But on the other hand, the remembrance and reconciliation is not a very easy task to do. It's easier said than done. That's just so much true if you look at history. Mr. Tangen, before we go, briefly from you.
There's one issue for the American. It's not so much the start and end of the Korean War. It's what happened politically with 3 presidents who tried but not successfully to bring about a denuclearized North Korea. And that's what's standing in the way historically now.
All right. Ainer Tangen, Zhao Tong, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. We hope those relatives of the war dead will see their family members coming back home, and there will be a wound smooth up as a result. Thank you so much for joining us. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.